Hey guys, tonight we're curling up in a damp, drafty room in 9th century Ireland, where the wind rattles the shutters of a stone building perched on the edge of a gray, peat-scented bog. You're wrapped in a scratchy, woolen robe, hunched over a low wooden desk. A stub of candle flickers beside you, casting trembling shadows across a half-finished page of Latin text. Outside, it's raining sideways. Inside, it's not much better. Smells like mold, ink, and sheep. Welcome to the medieval scriptorium, where boredom isn't just a mood, it's a way of life. And yes, your back already hurts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the current time in the comments. I love knowing who else is up with me in the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across uneven stone slabs toward your tiny wooden stool. It creaks under your weight, not because you're heavy, but because it's older than your grandfather's grandfather. The air in the scriptorium tastes like old candle wax and damp wool, and you can hear Brother Sean coughing in the far corner again. He's been copying Leviticus for weeks, and might be catching a cold or just losing the will to live. The place isn't quiet, despite what you might imagine. There's the constant scrape of quills, the slosh of water basins used to soften hides, the occasional belch from Brother Tomas, and once in a while, a muffled curse when someone knocks over an inkwell. The walls are thick, stone gray, streaked with moisture, and somewhere, water drips rhythmically like a metronome set to eternal despair. You shuffle past rows of desks toward your assigned place, third from the left, under the high narrow window that lets in the kind of light that barely qualifies as helpful. You pass by Brother Aidan, who is hunched over a folio of the Psalms and looks like he's aged 5 years since breakfast. His eyes meet yours for a second, and it's the kind of look that says, if I see one more et verbum domini, I'll scream, your job today? More copying. Always copying. The head of the scriptorium, a man with a beard that might actually be its own religious order, slides a page toward you. You sigh so hard it fogs your spectacles. If you're lucky, today you'll get to copy from a relatively straightforward homily, instead of, say, Revelation with its winged beasts and hellfire. That one made Brother Fergus cry. Here's the part nobody told you when you took vows and dedicated your life to God. You'd be spending most of it bent over a page, painstakingly duplicating someone else's words, letter by letter, all while freezing, cramping, and wondering if ink poisoning is a real thing. Spoiler alert, it is. But still, you dip your quill, made from a goose feather you had to pluck yourself, thank you very much, into the ink pot and begin. The first letter is a crisp capital Q, with a swirling tail that takes you 5 whole minutes. You blink hard to clear your vision, and hope no one notices the slight smudge near the ascender. And yet, this is where some of the strangest, funniest, and oddly touching parts of history get born. Right here, in this tedious, repetitive, cramp-inducing environment. Because medieval monks, they were just like you, tired, underpaid, well, unpaid technically, and human. And when humans get bored, they get weird. That weirdness sneaks out between the lines of the sacred text. It hides in the margins. Literally. Over time, you start to notice them, those little scribbles off to the side. A snarky note about how hard the work is. A random drawing of a face, tongue, sticking out. An actual line that says, I am so tired. Marginalia, they call it now. Back then, it was just the verbal equivalent of sighing into your pillow. Historians still argue whether these margin notes were personal expressions, quiet rebellion, or subtle kind of art. You just know it feels good to vent. You write your own little note next to the 6th repetition of the Lord is good. It says, yes, we get it. Of course, you don't always get away with it. The abbot once caught Brother Mail scribbling a tiny cartoon of a bishop riding a goose. The punishment was silence and extra pages. He didn't draw again for weeks. But then he came back with a whole menagerie tucked beside Acts. You're not entirely sure how this life became yours. You remember being young, scrappy, and convinced you were going to be one of those monks who illuminated pages with shimmering gold leaf and vivid blue lapis. Instead, you're 4 years deep into copying sermons by candlelight and growing suspicious of your own handwriting. One fringe detail you overheard Brother Declan whisper: some monks used their own blood when they ran out of ink. You look down at your ink pot and feel a bit less grumbly. For now, you stretch your back and listen to it crack like ancient bark. In a corner, someone sneezes so hard the whole room startles. You glance at the side of your page. The parchment is faintly freckled with what could be old ink, or possibly something else. Don't think about it too hard. They say every page holds a little piece of the monk who wrote it. If that's true, then your page currently contains equal parts sanctity, sarcasm, and resentment toward the goat who kept you up all night. Still, as you settle into the rhythm, the dip, the stroke, the brief thrill of a correctly shaped E, you feel something else. Not quite peace, but a sort of resignation that somehow becomes its own kind of comfort. You're part of something ancient and sacred, and possibly ridiculous. There's a sneeze, a muttered curse, a splash of ink. Another day in the monastery. Another page for history. You run your fingertips lightly over the surface of the parchment, tracing the bumps and grooves where the animal's life once left its mark. The texture isn't like paper, not smooth, not forgiving. It's almost like skin, because, well, it is. Sheep, goat, calf. Sometimes you can even smell a hint of pasture if the parchment hasn't been cured quite right. You wrinkle your nose. Today's page smells like wet dog and old socks. Another fine gift from Brother Kieran, the monastery's least subtle tanner. You shift on your stool, legs gone half numb again. The chill from the stone floor climbs through your sandals and into your bones. This scriptorium is not what you'd call ergonomic. There's a small brazier burning in the corner, but unless you're seated inside it, you're not getting much warmth. You glance over at it longingly. Then you remember what happened last time someone got too close. Brother Podrick nearly lit his robe on fire. He still smells like burnt wool. Before you write a single word, there's a whole routine. First, you must prepare the quill. It's a goose feather trimmed with a penknife down to a precise angle. Too sharp, and it'll tear the parchment. Too blunt, and the letters look like a toddler tried to forge a royal decree. You test the tip on a scrap bit of hide. Not bad. Maybe today won't be awful. Then there's the ink. You dip into a little pot of what looks like dark treacle, but smells like burnt toast and vinegar. Made from soot, water, and gum arabic, it's mixed fresh every few days, and depending on who's mixing, it can either glide on the page or glop like cold porridge. Today's batch is somewhere in between. You begin with a majuscule, an oversized, ornamental letter. The kind that marks the start of a holy passage, though it feels less holy and more like drawing the same curly over and over until your fingers go numb. But there's something satisfying about the stroke, the press of nib to skin, the tiny squeak it makes as you draw out each curve. The smell of inked sheep and burning peat starts to blur into one background aroma, the signature scent of your life now. You'd bottle it and sell it as Monk Number 5 if you weren't forbidden from engaging in commerce. Not that anyone's exactly begging for ode to medieval workspace. You glance at the tools around you, a knife for trimming the parchment's rough bits, a ruler for lining your columns, a pumice stone to smooth mistakes. There's even a little sandbag for drying the ink if you get impatient. None of it feels very mystical or spiritual, but all of it matters. One wrong press of the knife and the parchment rips. One slip of the hand and your sermon ends in a big, inky blob that looks like a startled pig. Historians still argue whether these elaborate preparation rituals were strictly practical or carried symbolic meaning. Was trimming the parchment a form of spiritual purification, or just an elaborate way to keep monks too busy to start questioning things? You don't dwell on that long. Your stomach growls loudly enough to echo off the stone walls. Lunch is still hours away, and last night's dinner was mostly turnips pretending to be soup. You fantasize about honey cakes or fresh fish, or even just warm bread with butter thick enough to spread with a trowel. Instead, you get another page of Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, again. The work is precise, rhythmic. There's a strange hypnosis to it. The letters start forming a kind of silent chant. You almost feel proud when you get through 3 clean lines without a mistake. Then your quill snaps. You stare at it, the broken nib pointing up like a tiny middle finger from the universe. You don't scream. You don't cry. You just slowly rise and walk to the tool shelf to fetch another feather. You're not even mad. This is your life now. Back at your desk, you start trimming a new quill with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgery or picking a splinter out of someone's eye. You could do this in your sleep. And sometimes it feels like you were doing it in your sleep. Over by the doorway, Brother Don Chad yawns, so why do you think his jaw might pop? He's working on one of the Gospels, muttering each word under his breath like it might bite him. He hasn't blinked in 10 minutes. You make a mental note to check that he's still breathing later. What's strange is how alive these rooms are, despite the monotony. Every creak of wood, every sneeze, every little grumble and grunt and ink blot becomes part of the story. You could read 1,000 manuscripts and still smell the rooms they were born in. Quirky fact time. Some monks, feeling cheeky or exhausted or both, would write notes to future readers. One such gem. Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. You feel that deeply. As you continue, you start to feel the page fight back. Parchment isn't passive. It warps, curls, even resists ink if it's too oily. You smooth it down with your palm, then your sleeve. Then you realize you've smudged ink onto your robe. Again. Brother Aidan once tried to clean a parchment with spit. He got a lecture that included the phrase, defilement of sacred vessels. He cried in the latrine for an hour. You look out the tiny window, really more of a slit, and see gray sky low and heavy like a soggy blanket. Rain again. Of course. You can almost hear it hiss against the stones, trying to sneak inside. You wonder what it would be like to copy manuscripts somewhere warm. Then you remember that's heresy. Comfort is for the afterlife. Your fingers ache. You flex them, shake them, try to imagine you're holding something lighter than a quill, like maybe a warm mug or a spoon dipped in honey. But no, just more ink, more sheepskin, more Latin that insists on conjugating verbs into oblivion. You sigh, and just before you lower your hand back to the page, you notice something, a tiny doodle in the margin. Not yours. Not from today. It's faded, rough, possibly drawn with a stick of charcoal. It looks like a chicken wearing boots. You smile. Just a little. Someone centuries before you got just as bored, just as cold, just as stuck in the loop of letters and ink and sacred words. And in that moment, they thought, you know what this page needs? A chicken in boots. And now you're smiling at it across time. That's something, isn't it? You press your new quill to the parchment with a sigh, feeling the familiar sting in your lower back. The sun, such as it is in this watery place, has shifted slightly through the narrow window slit, casting light across your desk in a long, tired line. You finished 5 full lines and managed only one mistake, remarkable considering your left leg went numb around the third. You're halfway through a copied homily when your nib catches the parchment just wrong, leaving a blotch like a squashed beetle beside the word Salvator. You groan and whisper a small prayer, though whether it's for forgiveness or just patience, you're not entirely sure. You dip the knife into your kit, scrape the blot away, carefully, because too much pressure and you'll go straight through the hide. You don't want another hole like last week, when your page suddenly looked like it had been attacked by moths. But that mistake, it sparks something. Something you've seen others do, quietly, sneakily, behind the sacred words. You glance down at the edge of the folio, just under the block of Latin, and slowly, deliberately, you're right. My hand is weary. The ink is thin. God preserve me from another psalm. And there it is, your first marginalia. A small rebellion. a little whisper into the future. If someone reads this one day, you hope they laugh or sigh in solidarity. You wouldn't be the first. One of your favorite monks, though you've never met him, not truly, is the mysterious voice behind a scribble in an Irish manuscript from the 9th century. It reads, "I'm very cold. My hand is stiff. The ink is bad. The vellum is bad. The light is bad." You remember it because you muttered it yourself 100 times. Whoever that monk was, he wasn't copying the Gospel of John with unwavering joy. He was just done, and he left his sigh behind, pressed into the skin of a sheep and the spine of history. There's something charming, almost cozy about it, that even surrounded by holy words, sacred duties, and high expectations, monks found time to roll their eyes onto the page. Not quite heretical, but definitely human. You think of Brother Rian, the youngest in the scriptorium. He once inked a margin with a tiny line that read, "Let this writing be finished. Let it end. Amen." You'd scolded him at the time, mostly because the abbot was nearby, but secretly, you still chuckle about it. Marginalia wasn't just for venting, though. Sometimes you come across a helpful correction or a whispered aside, notes on grammar, commentary on doctrine, or little glosses that translate tricky Latin phrases into Old Irish. These feel more formal, more acceptable, but they still speak to that same need to be heard, even in the quietest of rooms. Historians still argue whether these scribbles were tolerated or quietly punished. Did the scribes hope their notes would be seen, or did they imagine them fading into obscurity? Some even think a few marginal jokes were coded critiques of church doctrine, a sly little smirk at the establishment. You don't know about all that, but you do know that when your fingers are numb and your eyes are full of tiny, identical letters, it feels good to break the spell, to make a mark that's yours, not a saint's or an apostle's. Yours. You glance again at your own margin note. It's simple, a little sad, but real. You add another. The cat walked across the page. Again. Not true exactly, but it could be. There are at least 3 monastery cats, though they seem to have unionized and no longer care about mice. They do, however, love curling up on warm vellum. Brother Seamus once lifted a page and found a full paw print on him. That made it into the final copy, by the way. No one could figure out how to scrape it off. Some monks, in a fit of either inspiration or desperation, wrote full poems into the margins. Short, clipped verses, sometimes spiritual, often not. A scribe might be mid-sermon when suddenly a love poem, or a riddle, or a brief musing on the nature of death, time, or soup. You once saw a note that said, "The ink is thin. The soup was thinner." Still unclear whether that was literary metaphor or just lunch feedback. You shift again. Your spine clicks like a badly made hinge. You take a long blink, one of those that threatens to roll right into a nap. But before your head drops onto the desk, and yes, that's happened more than once, you shake yourself and lean closer. The text you're copying now is a bit of St. Augustine. Lots of guilt, lots of longing. You resist the urge to doodle a little sad face beside it. Or maybe a monk with steam rising off his head. A few desks over, Brother Lorcan lets out a breath so long and theatrical, it might count as a psalm of its own. You all know the sound. It means he's discovered a mistake halfway down a nearly finished page. That's a start-over situation. You whisper a quiet prayer for him, though you keep it brief, because prayers, like ink, must be rationed when you're this tired. You wonder how many anonymous monks out there exist only in the form of a margin note. Men whose lives left no other trace. No biography, no canonization, not even a grave with a name. Just a line beside a line. A sigh, a joke, prayer. A mistake corrected in red ink and initialed with a tiny, sarcastic flourish. And now here you are. Another tired scribe, another quiet complaint, another little note that says, "I was here, and I was so bored." The bell rings in the courtyard, barely audible, muffled by walls and weather, but it's the signal for the midday meal. You stretch again. Knees creak. Fingers crack. You cap your ink pot and press a clean blotter to your page. You stare at it one last time before leaving. Not your best work. But somewhere in the margins, the real you peeks through. You shuffle into the refectory with the others, a slow-moving procession of stiff backs, ink-stained fingers, and quiet sighs. Your hands are cold. Everything is cold. Even the bread feels like it was baked during the Ice Age and left out on a windowsill ever since. You chew it anyway, because complaining too loudly gets you latrine duty, and no marginal note is worth that. After the midday meal, bread, turnip broth, and something that might have once been cheese, you head back into the scriptorium. Your seat creaks under you. Your legs protest. Your spine sounds like someone stepping on dry twigs. But none of that matters, because the work waits. It always does. You unroll the next folio, and something catches your eye immediately. There, along the edge, drawn in reddish ink, is a miniature of a monk, no taller than your thumb, with a quill twice his size and a look of panic on his face. He's mid-fall, tumbling out of the margin, arms flailing, and beside him, in tidy minuscule script, thus he fell from grace, having misspelled eternity. You snored. Actually snored. A sound so unmonastic, Brother Rian turns and gives you the scandalized eyebrow. You don't care. That monk, whoever he was, just made your day. There's a long tradition of visual jokes in the margins, though nobody ever talks about it. Monks drew everything from grumpy dogs chasing lazy scribes to fish playing harps to what appears to be a nun sword fighting a snail. Yes, a snail. Historians still argue whether those armored snails were symbolic of sin, cowardice, or just the result of monks having been locked indoors for far too long. You lean forward to study the falling scribe again. The detail's amazing. You can see individual hairs in his tonsure. Someone spent precious time on this, time they probably should have been using to copy Deuteronomy. But hey, priorities. There's a kind of joyful defiance in these drawings, a reminder that even in a world of strict routines and sacred duties, creativity still found a way to wiggle in through the gaps. And sometimes that creativity looked like a cat chasing a bishop, or a dog playing a lute, or a chicken riding a goat. You once found a drawing of a dragon curled around the capital P in Pater Noster, its tongue flicking out like it was licking the word. Brother Seamus called it blasphemy. You thought it was adorable. Historians like to call this stuff grotesques or marginalia flourishes. You prefer medieval mischief, because really that's what it is, a scribe's way of saying, I'm still here. I still have a sense of humor. And I've looked at this same page for 6 straight hours, so yes, I drew a cow wearing spectacles. You turn to a fresh page and start your next assignment. The Book of Hours. Short prayers, seasonal devotions, little instructions on how to be a good person and not be smote. It's technically light reading, but it requires just as much precision. You copy the phrase, Domini labia mea aperis, and then immediately wish the Lord wouldn't open your lips so much as let you take a nap. You pause tapping your quill against the desk, and in the corner of the page, you add a tiny doodle. Just a little owl, wearing a hood, reading a scroll. You smile. The owl looks smarter than you feel. These marginal creatures, owls, monkeys, hybrid beasts with human heads and fish tails, were sometimes just doodles. Sometimes they had meaning. Some scholars think they were used to make the reader pause, to create visual markers or even mnemonic devices. Others think they were code, little bits of satire or protest smuggled past the watchful eye of the abbot. And some believe they were just born from long hours and exhausted minds. You lean back and remember a page from an old psalter you saw once. Someone had turned the tale of a decorative Q into a fox climbing a ladder. No one knew why, but there it was, just hanging on a ladder for all eternity. Some poor fox, mid-ascent, still trying to make his point. Brother Domnall once said the margins were like dreams, the place where the subconscious of the monastery slipped out when no one was looking. He also said mushrooms were forest meat, so you take that with a grain of salt. You realize you've been staring at your owl for too long and shake yourself back into motion. The light has shifted again. Shadows pool in the corners of the room like water. Outside, rain taps against the leaded window in the rhythm of an impatient pen tapping parchment. You go back to copying one line, then another. But your eyes keep flicking toward the edge of the page. It's like the margin calls to you now. A quiet whisper, draw something. Say something. Be just a little bit irreverent. And so, in between, O Lord, come quickly to help me, and blessed be the Lord, you squeeze in a new doodle. A snail, wearing armor, facing off against a monk with a broom. It's ridiculous. You love it. You wonder how many centuries from now someone might see this and laugh. Or maybe they'll scratch their heads and say, this must be allegorical. They'll never guess it was because your quill slipped and the snail just happened. Sometimes a snail is just a snail. Sometimes it's a protest against monotony. And sometimes it's just what happens when you've had too many turnips and not enough sleep. You take a sip of stale water from the clay jug beside your desk. The taste is exactly what you'd expect from water stored next to a stack of hides. You grimace, but your work waits. As your hand moves across the page, you realize something. These margins, these small bits of whimsy, are a kind of secret history. Not the kind you learn in lectures or read in treatises. The kind you find only in ink and sheepskin, in tiny scribbled figures that no one was supposed to notice. And now you've joined them. You're part of the margin. You look down at your armored snail again and give him a nod. He nods back. Probably. You wake up with your forehead mashed into the desk and a line of drool connecting your lip to the book of hours. It's not your proudest moment. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, but you're too disoriented to know if it's for Vespers or just another sign that time is a flat circle. You blink, sit up slowly, and check the damage. One blurred word, a smudge, and a small wrinkle where your cheek pressed into the vellum. Not great, but not disastrous. You whisper a sleepy apology to the saint whose prayer now looks like it's been through a flood. As you gently blot the smudge and pretend nothing happened, your thoughts drift to something you saw once in the Abbey library. A page from an Irish psalter with a mysterious comment in the margin. No drawing this time, no armored snail or falling monk, just 5 solemn words. I'm alone with God. That one stayed with you. Not all marginalia were jokes or doodles. Some were painfully honest. Quiet admissions, whispered prayers, little cries from the heart. You remember being 12, newly tonsured, barely able to hold your quill straight. You found a margin note that said, my soul is heavy, my hands are tired, and you thought, yes, that's exactly it. Marginal notes like these are scattered all across monastic manuscripts, tiny reflections of the interior lives of men trained to keep silent, to suppress, to pray instead of scream. And here, right in the margins, they let it slip. One monk wrote, this is a long, dreary task. O Lord, help me. Another confessed, my eyes are dim, my thoughts are dark. And yet another, in a tone that could be either existential dread or simple boredom. Time passes. Nothing changes. Historians still argue whether these notes were spiritual meditations or the medieval equivalent of I hate Mondays. Maybe they were both. Maybe when the work is that repetitive, the line between devotion and despair gets fuzzy. You've written similar things yourself, though yours tend to be a bit more passive-aggressive. Like that time you copied an entire homily on humility, then scrawled in the corner, if I get any more humble, I'll disappear. Not your most pious moment, but honest. You glance over at Brother Connell, seated 2 desks away, his head bobbing dangerously with sleep. You'd bet 3 figs he's mentally composing his next marginal poem. The man has a flair for melancholy. Last week, you caught a note in his psalter that read, I write in the dark and live in silence. Beneath it, a doodle of a candle with wings. You wonder if the abbot ever notices these things. Probably not. Or maybe he does and pretends not to. There's a silent agreement, an unspoken pact. So long as the sacred words are copied correctly, the margins are yours. Yours to lament in, to laugh in, to breathe in. You scratch your head. The tonsure itches more in the spring. You reach for your penknife, not to trim your hair, but to clean your nib, a delicate operation that makes you feel more like a surgeon than a monk. As you begin the next page, the repetition sets in again. The Latin is flowing, the ink just dark enough, the letters curling neatly like vines. But inside, your mind wanders. And it lands oddly on one particular note from an old manuscript, a comment you've never forgotten. The Lord is my shepherd, but I am very lost. That one. That one made you laugh until you nearly spilled your ink pot. But there's something haunting in it too. Because yes, it's a joke, but it's also a cry. And in a place like this, where everyone is expected to suffer in silence, the margin becomes your only confidant. Even the language of these margin notes varies. Latin dominates, sure, but sometimes you spot Old Irish slipping in personal words closer to the skin. One page might read, Amen, Amen, and just beneath it is a synod doer say, ACH ni thuagim. That's what he said, but I don't understand it. You relate. Often. You wonder how many scribes were faking it, copying without comprehension, just shapes and strokes without grasping the meaning. And you wonder if the margin was the only place they could admit it. The rain outside thickens. You can hear it now, a steady rhythm on the stone, like the drumbeat of time or the world's slow applause for your endurance. You steal a glance at the candles. Their flames wobble slightly in the damp air, bending like they too are tired of standing upright. You pause your copying, flex your fingers, and reach again for the blank edge of the parchment. This time no joke, no doodle, just a line. The hours stretch like winter. It feels good to write it. Like exhaling, you imagine some far-off reader seeing it and nodding, the way you once did. Across centuries, across silence, another soul answering, yes, me too. You know that not all monks left traces like these. Some followed every rule, kept the margins clean, never strayed from the prescribed lines. You try not to judge them. But honestly, you find them a little suspicious. No one's that focused. Not for hours. Not in this cold. Not while copying the rule of St. Benedict for the third time this season. Even St. Benedict himself, the originator of the monastic rule, likely wouldn't have minded the occasional scribbled sigh. After all, his writings emphasize humility, community, and a bit of common sense. He knew that humans were machines. He knew monks would falter, that they'd grumble. So maybe in some small way, the margin is holy too. You return to your text. Carefully, reverently, you copy the next phrase, "May my mouth speak truth." And in the corner, because you can't help yourself, you add, "But my eyes want sleep." You press your fingers into the small of your back, stretch until your vertebrae protest, and glance out the window. The sky is gray again. Or maybe still. You lose track. You look at your margin and smile. It's small. It's weary. But it's honest. And that's something. The wind moans like a hungry ghost through the cloister arches as you trudge toward the dormitory, your candle guttering in protest. Behind you, the scriptorium sleeps, but in your mind, the pages are still glowing, lit with odd little monks tumbling from the margins, tiny dragons curling in the loops of capital letters and half-hidden laments scribbled in the language of the tired. But tonight you're not done yet. Not quite. Because there's one set of marginalia that stuck with you all day, the weather notes. Yes, weather notes. Of all the divine, eternal, saintly words you copy daily, the comments that sometimes bring the most joy are the ones where some long-dead monk decided to stop mid-psalm and write, "It is snowing again. I am cold. So cold. It happens more than you'd expect." These monks, your longing brethren, had the habit of recording the day's weather in the margins like a tiny medieval meteorology log. A thunderstorm here. Flood warning there. One particularly desperate soul, somewhere in the 9th century, left this gem in Irish script next to a dense tract on St. Kieran. The wind is like knives. I long for a fire. Or death. Dark? Yes. Relatable. Incredibly. And these weren't idle scribbles. In a world where every hour was dictated by bells, and every bell echoed through stone halls that never changed temperature, the weather mattered. It shaped your mood, your work, even your theology. One famous comment from a scribe in the Book of Armagh reads, "Today is bitter. The ink freezes in the pot. My fingers rebel. You feel that in your bones." Even the color of ink sometimes changes with the weather, blacker in dry heat, faded gray when the fog rolls in. You've seen pages where the writing gets progressively more jagged, and you just know the monk was shivering uncontrollably. That's not poor penmanship, that's frostbite in action. Historians still argue whether these weather notes were intended as records or just personal groans tucked away between the lines of salvation. But for you, there's something more, a glimpse into the real life of the monastery, the humanity that peeked through the parchment. You remember copying a homily once when Brother Lorcan came stumbling in from the garden, drenched and furious. He'd been tending the herb beds when the skies opened up and turned everything to mud. Later that day, you found a note in the margin of the very manuscript he'd been illuminating. God has drowned the time again. Perhaps a sign. You chuckled then. You still do. Your candle wobbles in the hallway to draft, and you cup your hand around it. The shadows it throws stretch up the stone walls like tall monks made of smoke. You think of another margin you once read. This wind howls like the devil, but I suppose even he needs a hobby. You push open the dormitory door, careful not to creak the hinges, though honestly, they creak whether you ask them to or not. A dozen straw-stuffed mattresses line the room. You crawl onto yours, not even bothering to undress. Too tired. Too cold. As you pull your rough wool blanket over your knees, your thoughts drift again to the margins. The monks who sat where you now sit, who complained about the very same chill, the same cracked knuckles, the same endless drizzle. There's comfort in that, because for all the talk of divine mission and sacred duty, being a monk was also deeply, crushingly human. And in a world where confession was structured and repentance scheduled, sometimes the only safe place to groan about your stiff joints or frozen feet was beside Psalm 23. You lie back and remember the margin you discovered just a week ago. Written in a slanting, hurried hand between two columns of biblical commentary, rained for 4 days. God's patience must be longer than mine. Was that sarcasm? Prayer? Cry for help? Yes. And that's the beauty of these notes. They're layered, shaded, ambiguous. They're the margins talking back to the sender. The human reaching toward the divine with an inky shrug. You once found a weather note written across 3 different pages, 3 sequential stormy days, each one more dramatic than the last. Day 1, thunder again. The pigs are afraid. So am I. Day 2, lightning struck the fence post. It smokes still. Day 3, I think God is trying to write too. You laugh into your blanket, quietly, so as not to wake Brother Owen, who snores like a dying bellows. There's something about that third line that never left you. God, writing in lightning, a competing author. You imagine him frowning at your clumsy calligraphy and deciding to correct the margins with a well-placed thunderbolt. You roll to one side and think about the future, about the next manuscript you'll be assigned, the next chill that'll creep into your robe, the next grumble you'll try not to say out loud. But you know one thing for certain. You'll mark it in the margin, because the weather will not be denied. Even when copying the eternal word, a scribe has to acknowledge the immediate, the snow on the sill, the damp in the wood, the drip, drip, drip of rain through the cracked eaves. Those little weather notes might seem like background noise, but they're part of the song too. They remind you that history isn't just the grand sermons and the ornate illuminations. It's the damp footprint, the soggy sleeves, and the note that reads, "It is too wet to work. I am working anyway." You close your eyes. The wind sings against the shutters. You picture a monk centuries from now, reading your own margin note, storm tonight. The roof leaks again, but the ink still flows. Maybe he'll nod. Maybe he'll smile. Maybe he'll add his own. And so the weather will go on, storm by storm, side by side, one margin at a time. You're awake again before the bell, which means either you're evolving into some sort of nocturnal creature, or your brain is permanently stuck in monk mode. Either way, you lie there under your scratchy wool blanket, staring into the dark dormitory ceiling, listening to the familiar chorus, Brother Owen snoring like a drowned cow, Brother Finn muttering fragments of Latin in his sleep, Dominus, Dominus, and the soft shuffle of rats in the rafters, who, if you're being honest, are starting to seem like fellow residents. You say, there's no going back to sleep, so you rise, creaking out of bed like an old floorboard, and shuffle down the hall with your candle. You make your way back to the scriptorium, because where else would you be? And because today, you're revisiting a manuscript that has perhaps the most elaborate, ridiculous, and mysteriously delightful marginalia you've ever seen. The cat Psalter. No, that's not a joke. Someone, some poor, glorious soul, had an actual cat. And not a theoretical, allegorical Christ is the lion kind of cat. A literal feline. A fur-shedding, ink-smearing, chaos-loving ball of whiskers who apparently enjoyed long naps on priceless manuscripts and casual strolls across wet ink. And the best part, the monk wrote about it. The notes begin simply enough. One margin features a neat, lowercase complaint. Pangorban has returned. Pangorban. That was the cat's name, which, if you're rusty on your old Irish poetry, means white Pangur. It's also the name immortalized in that little poem monks learn by heart, the one where the scribe compares his work to his cat's relentless mouse hunting. You remember the lines, I and Pangorban, my cat slash, to the like task we are at. The monk hunts meaning in words, the cat and mice. Both are tireless. Both are proud. You love that poem. But the real Pangorban, if he was anything like your abbey cats, was probably more interested in sleeping on open codices and using the Psalms as a scratching post. One page you remember clearly features smudging paw prints trailing across the lower corner, as the cat just had to chase something that was definitely not there. Right next to the prints, the monk added, Again he walks through my work. May God forgive him, for I cannot. Historians still argue whether the monk was being playful or dead serious. But based on the thick, frustrated pen strokes that follow, you bet he was one ink blot away from excommunicating the cat. There's another page in a different manuscript where a smear of red ink, probably from a sanctified heading, is clearly dragged in a half-circle arc, as though a tail had been dipped and then proudly swished across the page. Beside it, a marginal note, equal parts exasperated and resigned. He has marked it his own. You chuckle softly, tracing your finger across the blank margin of your current work. No cats here, not today. But you've seen a few mice brave the corner shelves. Maybe Pangor's descendants still roam the abbey halls, keeping the same low profile until it's time to disrupt something valuable. The truth is, cats and monasteries go way back. You might think of monks as all solemn chants and strict silence, but many had a surprising fondness for animals, cats especially. They were useful, yes, for controlling rodents, but they also provided companionship in a life that could feel unbearably quiet. And it wasn't just scribes with feline sidekicks. There are entire sets of marginalia believed to have been co-authored by pets. Take the now famous manuscript with the words, "Cursed be the paws that smudge this prayer." You've seen it. And the ink trail, unmistakably cat-shaped. Then there's the anonymous monk who once paused a theological reflection to scribble in the corner. I hear the beast again. He hunts by candlelight. Was it a rat? A cat? Particularly ambitious shadow? No one knows. But the image stays with you. Monks and mice and one determined cat, all circling around the same candle, each one trying to find something. Knowledge, food, maybe just a warm spot to nap. You once had a brief run-in with a cat in the scriptorium yourself. A gray one, sleek and smug, who leapt up onto your desk without warning and stare at your work like a disappointed teacher. You just inked a particularly tricky capital G, and with the most theatrical flair you've ever witnessed in an animal, the cat yawned and walked straight across the still wet letter, leaving ghostly footprints behind. You didn't add a marginal note that day. You just sat there, stunned, watching the cat disappear between the shelves as if it were nothing more than a shadow with a tail. You think of that cat often. You wonder if medieval scribes sometimes created their most elaborate marginal drawings just to distract the cats. A dancing fox in the corner, a charging knight beside the text. Maybe it was all to lure the beast away from the sacred center. A medieval version of jingling keys. One scribe in Wales even seems to have developed a system. He drew little mice in the margins and marked them with subtle dots, possibly to record actual catches. Or maybe just to amuse the cat. Historians still debate that one. You sit back from your desk and let your eyes drift to the flickering candlelight. If you squint, the shadow on the wall almost looks like a cat, tail curled, crouched in ink-ready mischief. And maybe that's the real secret of marginalia. Maybe it wasn't just boredom or rebellion or a moment of existential crisis. Maybe sometimes it was play. Even in a world ruled by bells and rules and endless lines of black and red, there had to be room for play, for a paw print, a poem, a joke only the next scribe would see, a tiny rebellion in whiskers and fur. You dip your quill into the ink and consider, just for a moment, drawing a small cat in the bottom corner. Just the suggestion of one, arched back, tail mid-swish. You don't, but you think about it. Instead, you write one line in a tight, careful hand. He walks still, though I cannot see him. Then you return to your work. The real work. The sacred text. But as you copy the next line of Psalm 91, you swear you hear the soft pad of paws somewhere behind the shelves. The afternoon sun slants through the stained glass windows now, casting soft pools of colored light across the scriptorium floor. Reds like blood orange jam, blues like the lake just before it freezes over. You're bent over your parchment again, trying not to smudge the gilded capital you've spent the last 20 minutes painstakingly inking with a trembling hand and a goose quill that's seen better days. Your back aches. Your fingers ache. Honestly, even your thoughts ache. So naturally, your mind drifts to something that's kept you sane more times than you'd care to admit. Doodles. Yes, doodles. The lazy cousin of illumination. The off-duty illuminator's mischief. The stuff that somehow snuck past the censoring prior and ended up right there on the sacred page. And the medieval monks? Oh, they doodled like pros. You remember the first time you saw one. A perfect little man in the corner of a manuscript, mid-fall, his robe billowing like a caught sail, eyes wide in surprise. You couldn't tell if he was tumbling from heaven or slipping on something stupid like a banana peel, which would be impressive, considering bananas hadn't even reached Ireland yet. Either way, it was love at first scribble. There are entire manuscripts where the margins come alive with these sketches, some carefully composed, others just fast, twitchy little bursts of ink. A snail fighting a knight, a monkey playing bagpipes, a bishop making a very rude gesture at a passing donkey, and often no explanation, no context, just there. Historians still argue whether these doodles were meant to instruct, to joke, or to serve as a sort of spiritual self-soothing for men trapped in lives of silence and repetition. But to you, they feel like little sighs. The kind you let out after hours of repetition, when your hand won't stop cramping and your mind starts inventing reasons why that fish looks like it's judging you. One of your favorite doodles is from an old Irish psalter, tucked between Psalm 68 and 69. It's just a grumpy monk hunched over, tiny lines of steam rising from his head, and beside him, a dog laughing. A laughing dog. Is it symbolic of sin? Satan? Just Brother D. Armwood's unfortunate beagle? Who knows? But it's perfect. You smile thinking about it now. You shift on your wooden stool, which might as well have been carved from ambition alone for all the comfort it offers. Your candle sputters slightly, And in that flickering moment, you notice a new margin someone's added to the manuscript you're copying from, a small drawing of a snail wearing a bishop's mitre. You blink, then blink again. Yup, that's a snail, with a mitre. And if you squint, it might even be carrying a crozier. You lean closer, half expecting it to move. No one really knows what was going on with all the snails and medieval margins. They're everywhere. Fighting knights, fleeing saints, wearing absurd hats. Some scholars say they represent the Lombards, an Italian banking group unpopular in certain religious circles. Others think they symbolize the meek triumphing over the mighty. But personally, you're convinced monks were just losing it. Slowly, gloriously. After all, you spend 12 hours a day hunched over the same verses, the same ink, the same lines. And sometimes you just need to draw a snail declaring war on a frog. You just do. One scribe you read about, Brother Cormac, they think, was notorious for his doodles. He worked at a monastery in County Meath and had a reputation for leaving tiny illustrations in the upper margins. Little devils playing lutes, naked saints doing cartwheels, a cow leaping over the moon a good 700 years before Mother Goose got the idea. You try to imagine what the prior must have thought, coming across those pages. Probably a long, slow sigh. Maybe a whispered prayer for patience. But did he erase them? No. That's the part that sticks with you. Most of the doodles stayed. Not just because removing them would damage the manuscript, but because, deep down, they were tolerated, even treasured. Quiet acts of rebellion that made the pages more human, more alive. There's one particularly cheeky example from a gospel manuscript where the scribe, clearly having a rough day, drew an archer in the margin pointing an arrow directly at a saint head in the main text. It's subtle, but unmistakable. And right beside it, in tiny script, "Forgive me, O Lord." He was asking for it. You'd never dared try something so bold. But you thought about it. Oh, you thought about it. Sometimes, late at night, you imagine your own future marginal legacy. Maybe a little dragon curled around your favorite verse. Or a chicken in armor, sword raised mid-cluck. Something that would make the next scribe pause, blink, and laugh silently into their sleeve. Because that's the real magic, isn't it? These aren't just scribbles. They're echoes. Jokes meant for an audience hundreds of years away. They're time-traveling chuckles, reminders that monks weren't just saints in training. They were bored, lonely, brilliant weirdos with a quill and too much time. You glance at your own page. The margins are clean. But just for fun, in the very bottom corner, you gently sketch the faint outline of a rabbit juggling 3 apples while riding a fish. It's tiny. It won't distract from the sacred text. But maybe someday someone will find it. Maybe they'll smile. Maybe they'll add a goose in the next margin over. And so the doodle chain will continue. Because long after the sermons fade and the names are forgotten, those tiny bursts of joy, snails and mitres, dancing cats, warrior frogs, will remain. Ink ghosts, still giggling in the corners. You're in the cloister garden now, not because you've taken a sudden vow of fresh air, but because the scriptorium smells like boiled turnips and despair. The prior's taken to eating lunch at his desk again, and no one has the courage to tell him that hot cabbage and old vellum do not pair well. So here you are, perched on a mossy bench, letting the breeze comb through your robe while you flip through an older manuscript you borrowed, accidentally on purpose. You're not looking for divine inspiration. You're looking for the notes, the marginal jottings left by scribes who, like you, found themselves stuck between the lines. In this particular manuscript, it's a goldmine of what scholars like to call colophons, but you prefer to think of them as emotional venting, 9th century edition. Take the one at the end of a psalter from Clonmacnoise. You remember reading it before. This book was written in the 849th year of the Lord's incarnation. May whoever steals it be cursed with itching and no nails. Strong words. Stronger mental image. Colophons were traditionally used to identify the scribe, the date, sometimes even the location. But more often than not, they also offered a glimpse into the very human condition of the poor soul behind the quill. Complaints about the cold, complaints about the light, complaints about other monks, and always complaints about the copying itself. You turn another page and find a classic. It is finished. I am tired. May I never write again. Another one, beside a long genealogy of saints, simply reads, "What a stupid lineage." Historians still debate whether these were meant to be read by others, or just muttered confessions, the medieval version of writing in your diary and shoving it under your straw mattress. One of your personal favorites comes from a monk in County Kerry who scrawled, "It is Easter. I would rather be out among the sheep." You relate deeply. And these aren't just rare flukes. Dozens of manuscripts, particularly Irish ones, are absolutely riddled with these candid moments. Sometimes they're prayers, heartfelt and sincere. But other times, they veer into what can only be described as passive-aggressive. Like the one you once found halfway through a gospel transcription. "God, grant that this hand may not shrivel before the last word," followed a few lines later by, "Still writing, still not dead." You imagine the poor scribe, hunched like a boiled prawn, back locked into permanent curvature, eyelids fluttering with exhaustion as he counts how many more "verily, verily I say unto thee" verses he has left. You've been there. You are there. Frequently. You're reminded of the day last winter when the scriptorium fire went out and you had to keep working in finger-numbing cold, your ink freezing mid-letter. You were halfway through the Beatitudes and accidentally wrote, "Blessed are the meek, for they will chew the earth." Took you 10 minutes to catch it. Maybe you should have added your own colophon that day. Something like, "Blessed are the monks who don't freeze to death in this godforsaken draft." Another gust of wind lifts the edge of your borrowed parchment. You catch it just in time and spot a faint note in the lower corner, barely legible, almost lost to age. The ink is thin today. So am I. Now there's a poem hiding in plain sight. You've started keeping your own collection of favorite colophons, written down in a hidden page of your journal. Not the sacred one, of course. The other one. The one you deny owning, if asked. It's filled with things you're not supposed to say, much less write. Like Brother Declan sings like a dying goat, or the bishop's sermon lasted so long I aged visibly. You're not alone in this. Scribes have been leaving breadcrumb trails of their emotions across centuries. There's one manuscript from an anonymous Irish monk where every chapter ends with a slightly different farewell. So much pain in my wrist. My eyes are as heavy as the stone of Cashel. If you read this, pray for my spine. The last line is simply, "Thank Christ it's over." And that's what makes these colophons so extraordinary. Not the theology, not the poetry, but the humanity. These monks weren't divine machines churning out scripture. They were tired, hungry, bored men scratching their frustrations and hopes into the very margins of holiness. One even left a note during a famine. "We are 3 days without meat. I dream of chickens." You're not supposed to laugh at that, but you do. Softly. Because that, right there, is the real story. The sacred text might tell you how to live, but the colophons, they tell you how it felt. And every now and then, they even break your heart. Like the trembling hand that wrote at the close of a prayer book. "My brother died while I copied this." I finish it for him. No jokes there. Just silence. You fold the manuscript gently and set it in your lap. The wind dies down, and the garden is still. You can hear the bees nudging their way into the foxglove, the distant bleating of sheep from the pastures, the faint thud of Brother Aidan dropping something again in the herb garden. You wonder what colophon you'd write today, if you were brave enough. Still tired. Still here. But the sky is very blue. Or maybe the cabbage was bad. My work is good. All is balanced. Eventually, the bell rings, its low hum floating over the cloisters. Time to go back. To your stool. To your ink. To your silent, sacred labor. But before you rise, You run your finger one more time along that faded colophon. The ink is thin today. So am I. You smile. Then you stand, shoulders stiff, spine creaking like an old door hinge. And you go. Your eyes feel like boiled raisins. You haven't blinked in what feels like 100 years, and there's a faint ringing in your ears that could either be divine intervention or the aftermath of Brother Tig's musical attempt at matins this morning. Either way, your body is doing that thing where it subtly rebels, twitching knees, wandering thoughts, minor acts of treason in the form of daydreams. And as you shift in your seat, you find yourself thinking, not about the manuscript you're copying, not even about what's for supper, though it better not be lentils again, but about the small, scribbled voices you've come to love. The marginalia, the colophons, and now something else, the almost whispers. These are the tiny notations, the offhand comments, the unpolished thoughts monks left behind, sometimes buried within the sacred lines, other times wedged between paragraphs, half erased, half hidden, like secrets they weren't sure they should share, but couldn't quite keep in. You're deep in a borrowed gospel text, mid-genealogy of Christ, which, let's be honest, is just ancientancestry.com without the subscription. When you spot a faint line beneath a particularly long list of begots, I no longer know who this is for. It hits you like a sudden gust. Not funny, not poetic, just deeply, quietly human. It's these kinds of notes, the not quite colophons, that get under your skin. Scholars call them interpolations or scribal insertions, but you think of them more like spiritual sighs, not the polished complaints or joke drawings, but the raw crumbs of a tired soul. In one particularly worn Psalter from Kells, just beneath a decorative capital B, there's a squished little line written in a rush. I had a dream I was a fish. No worries. You'd laugh if it didn't feel so familiar. Some scholars believe these accidental inclusions were meditative fragments, dream reflections, inner thoughts that bubbled up during the endless repetition of transcription. Others think they were simply errors, moments when the mind wandered and the hand forgot to stop. But there's one school of thought gaining traction among fringe academics that insists these weren't accidents at all. They were intentional memory seeds, prayers not to be answered, but to be remembered. Like the note in a Munster manuscript, my mother died when I was a boy. She smelled of clove and barley, tucked right beside a passage from Isaiah. There's nothing theologically relevant about it. It doesn't illuminate the scripture. It doesn't belong. And yet it does. Because maybe the monk was copying Isaiah that day and just couldn't stop thinking of her. You run your thumb over the edge of your own manuscript. Your margin is blank. You've started noticing these ghost notes more often lately. Probably because you're reading manuscripts less like a scribe and more like a time traveler, eavesdropping on men who, despite their vows, couldn't quite keep their stories to themselves. You remember one from a gospel illumination, an angel floating upward towards stylized Christ figure, halo blazing, wings crisp. It's stunning work. But nestled inside the cloud line, barely visible, is a note in almost imperceptible script. I have not seen the sky in 6 weeks. So much for divine rapture. Sometimes they're wistful. I wonder if the sea sounds different in Rome. Sometimes they're mundane. Today I broke my shoe on the chapel step. Sometimes they're heartbreakingly unresolved. I cannot remember my father's voice. Historians still argue whether these moments were spiritual failures, evidence that monks were not fully committed to the holy task, or signs of their deeper humanity, the ways in which sacred practice and personal memory wove themselves together. You know where you stand. You think they're beautiful, necessary, the cracks where the light gets in, as the future poet would say. One of the more bizarre entries you came across last month read simply, "There are 4 mice in the wall. I have named them. You'd give anything to know their names." There's something intoxicating about imagining the daily life behind these jottings. A scratchy rope, a headache that won't quit, a kitchen fire that nearly burned down the south wing, a moment when everything felt too heavy, and instead of walking away, the scribe just paused and wrote, "I miss my dog, No context, no explanation, just grief in a sentence. You get up from your desk, stretch, and walk slowly down the corridor toward the storage room where old vellum scraps are kept. You dig out a torn page, nothing sacred, just a rough practice sheet, browned with time. You bring it back to your desk. You pick up your quill. And in the corner, you write, "I'm still tired. But I think this matters. It's not poetry. It won't survive the next perch. It may not even be read by anyone else. But it's real. And that's enough." You go back to your copying. The letters roll out slowly, the ink obedient for once, the line straight. Your hand steadier than it's been in days. But as you work, you can't help smiling because you know that somewhere in a dusty corner of another monastery, a future monk is probably writing down something like, "I dream of dancing," in the open, in the sun, and he'll fold that dream into the margins of a sermon on humility, and no one will notice, except maybe you. You're in the library now, which is really just a drafty stone room with shelves that smell faintly of mildew and beeswax. The floor is uneven, the ceiling low enough to brush your head if you're not careful, and the air holds the quiet weight of too many whispered arguments about who misfiled the lives of the saints. Again. But you like it here. It's not the warmth, it's never warm. And it's definitely not the lighting. No, what draws you in is the density. This is where the words live. Layered, crumbling, stacked like geological strata. And today, you're here on a kind of treasure hunt. You're looking for the odd stuff. Because for all the weighty Bibles and Saints' Chronicles, this place is also a storage closet for the weird side of monastic writing. The prank notes, the doodles, the utter nonsense no one expected to survive and yet somehow did. Tucked between a heavy Latin grammar and a copy of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, you find one such gem, a tiny folio, almost square, clearly never meant for grand display. No illuminations, no gilded borders, just a few pages of cramped handwriting that gets sloppier as it goes. The first line reads, "A list of beasts known to shout at the moon." You laugh. You can't help it. It continues, 1 the red fox, 2 a goat angry, 3 Brother Owen during nightmares. It's part list, part poem, part whatever was happening that night. A small window into the absurdity that slips through when monks are very tired, or maybe a little bored, and no one's watching. One page is filled with repeated lines of "there was a frog in my shoe," written in increasingly erratic script. The last version simply says, "He left. I remain." What even is this? A fable? A diary? A very localized haunting? Historians still argue whether these fringe texts were private exercises, mnemonic games, or just low-key acts of rebellion. But you know better. These were therapy before therapy. And no therapist charges less than a ream of vellum. You keep flipping. Here's one with nothing but made-up proverbs. When the sheep sneezes, the harvest will fail. A silent goose means loud doom. And your favorite, never trust a monk who smiles at soup. You can picture the scribe now, hunched over his bench, a quill in one hand and a stale oatcake in the other, cackling softly to himself as he invents folk wisdom no one asked for. There's a term for these literary oddities, macaronic texts. They're written in a swirling blend of Latin and vernacular Irish, sometimes even Old Norse if you dig deep enough, all mashed together like linguistic stew. They're mostly nonsense, but joyful nonsense. Experimental. Like someone decided grammar was optional today, and the walls between languages just didn't matter anymore. You find one in the back of a devotional tract, Credo in Unum Cornflake, et cum spuma banbe. You'd translate it, but you can't. No one can. Even the experts admit defeat on some of these bits. They chalk them up to inside jokes, or maybe even training drills for younger scribes learning how to control the flow of ink. But sometimes, the texts feel purposeful in their absurdity, like performance art scribbled centuries before anyone invented the term. And then there are the riddles. Oh, the riddles. What walks on four legs in the morning, barks at dusk, and once dated a goose? You don't know. No one does. That's not the point. There's even a collection of riddles written entirely in puns, half of which are so specific to 9th century farming practices that you need 3 lexicons and a local farmer's ghost to understand them. But maybe that's part of the charm. These are echoes of laughter, buried in parchment, signs that even in a world dominated by obedience and austerity, the human impulse to be silly, to poke fun at life, to laugh at soup-smiling monks survived. You reach for another fragment, just a single sheet, and it reads, "Brother D. Armwood made me write this while he sat on my foot. May he be pestered by flies all summer." There's no signature, but you feel like you know the guy. And on the very bottom, in even smaller script, someone else, maybe years later, added, "He was." You grin. You wonder if the more formal monks knew these texts existed. Did they ever get read aloud behind the cloister during free hour? Whispered between the novices like ghost stories? Or were they just little bursts of mental survival, scribbled and forgotten, kept only because no one ever got around to scraping the parchment clean? You close the tiny folio and tuck it under your robe, careful not to fold the corner. You're not going to steal it exactly. You're just going to study it more deeply in solitude, in your cell, with a candle, and maybe a snort laugh or two, because you need this. You need to remember that even in the most rigid, rule-heavy place on Earth, someone once wrote a poem about a goat named Gerald who challenged St. Kieran to a wrestling match, and lost. Because yes, even monks needed comic relief. As you step out of the library, into the weak afternoon sun, you wonder how many other little manuscripts are tucked away in forgotten corners. How many other monks pressed the edges of their imagination into the margins? How many thought, even for a moment, that their foolishness mattered? You know better now. It does. Because it's not just the psalms or the sermons or the saints' lives that survive. It's the jokes, the scribbles, the frogs in shoes. You're lying on your narrow cot now, ruffle blanket tugged to your chin, listening to the wind pick its teeth on the edge of the monastery's stonework. It whistles through the window, slit like a grumpy banshee that's lost her schedule. But you're used to it. This is just night in medieval Ireland, moody, damp, and slightly judgmental. Your thoughts drift back to the margin ghosts and goat wrestling saints. But something tugs you further now. Past the jokes, deeper into the quiet, into the sacred weirdness that emerges when the veil between scripture and scrawled whimsy wears thin. Because not every marginal note is meant to amuse. Some are unnerving. Some leave you with a feeling you've walked in on something, seen through a keyhole into a moment too personal to be meant for another's eyes. Take, for instance, a note found beside the Litany of Saints in a 10th century Irish breviary. I saw her again in my dream. She walked away. Again. Nothing else. No name. No elaboration. Who is she? A lost sister? A lover renounced? A figment? Historians still argue whether such intimate notes were remnants of pre-monastic lives, signs of grief unresolved, or perhaps even trials of temptation rendered in ink to dispel their power. You just feel the echo. That quiet heartbreak lodged into a fold of holy prayer. You think of another manuscript, this one famously bound in tooled leather and used only for Easter Mass. Its margins are otherwise pristine. But at the very back, behind the benediction, there's a line. A lie during confession. I cannot say what. That one makes your stomach turn. It's the anonymity that gets you. These aren't signed. They weren't meant for readers. It's like the manuscript itself became the confessor. Or worse, the co-conspirator. And sometimes the notes aren't even words. There's a Psalter fragment where the scribe has drawn a tiny door in the margin. Just a square with a smaller rectangle inside, like a latch. No label. No explanation. But it looks inviting. Or maybe ominous. In another volume, near a passage from Jeremiah, Someone has doodled a spiral with perfect mathematical symmetry. No decorative reason. No liturgical purpose. It repeats in 4 other places in the manuscript. Always subtle, always tucked away. One scholar insists it's a symbol of divine perfection. Another thinks it's the medieval equivalent of a fidget spinner. You personally suspect mild madness. Or maybe all 3. Then there's the infamous Wolf Girl folio. You remember it well. It was part of a bestiary, a guide to God's creation and all its disturbing animal behavior. Lots of lions mauling deer and snakes sinning in vague, slithery ways. But in the margin of the folio on wolves, a scribe has sketched a human girl with fur on her back and long claws for feet. Above her, in tight, sharp lettering, she ran faster than the wind. They never caught her. No wolf in the main text behaves like that. No saint's story explains it. Some scholars dismissed it as folklore spillover. Others think it was a metaphor for temptation. But once you saw it, you couldn't forget her, this margin girl sprinting away from the page, beyond the edge of canon. Was she real? Does it matter? Because what's clear is this: the monks' margins were not always acts of boredom. Sometimes they were acts of release, of confession, of exorcism. They used their margins to trap thoughts too strange, too sorrowful, too secret for the main text. There's a school of thought that considers marginalia kind of dream logic, half-waking glimpses of the subconscious. And considering how little sleep most monks got, it's not a bad theory. It explains the sudden changes in tone, the strange symbolic sketches, the lonely lines that read more like dreams than diary. Like the one you saw last month, there is a shadow at the bottom of the well. It hums. No further comment. Or this gem from an Easter homily margin: if the lamb does not return, do we still feast? Even the monk who cataloged that folio just wrote. These are not theological annotations. They're windows into the foggy borderland between mysticism and mental wear. And that makes sense. Because life in a monastery is not all chants and clean robes. It's a grind. The long fasts, the hours spent alone in silence, the constant weight of moral perfection looming overhead. Sometimes it breaks a person just a little. And when it does, the margins receive them. You think about the monks who wrote those lines, and how many of them probably never spoke those thoughts aloud. Not once. Not to their abbots. Not to their brethren. Just to the parchment. Ink is quiet. It doesn't interrupt. And once it dries, it doesn't betray. There's one note you remember especially well. It appeared in a copy of the Book of Hours, somewhere in the intercessory prayers. I do not feel God today. It's written so softly, you almost need angled light to read it. Like it's whispering from the page. And even though you know that monk is long gone, buried under a mossy slab, you whisper back because it feels right, me neither. Then you roll over and close your eyes. Because this strange communion across time and space and sorrow is sacred too. Maybe even more than the texts themselves. You wake up to the scrape of a wooden stool, not your own. It's a memory, or maybe just your imagination, of a scribe shifting in his seat 1,000 years ago. His fingers cramped, his eyes cloudy from candlelight. He stretches his back with a wince, cracks a knuckle or two, and leans back in with a sigh. There's still a page to finish. Because even in the monastery's daily silence, time makes demands. Manuscripts must be copied, psalms transcribed, homilies duplicated for sister abbeys across the foggy aisles. And while the saints are immortal, deadlines are not. Today's focus is the physical side of all that effort, the very human toll the work took, and how those tolls ended up scribbled around the saints and sins in curious, sometimes hilariously grumpy marginalia. You're reading a particularly well-known gospel book when you spot it, a small spidery note in the corner of a nearly perfect page. My hand is tired. Simple. Honest. Possibly the earliest known version of send help committed to ink. And it's far from the only one. Turn another few folios, and there it is again. Oh, my hand. This time underlined. Dramatically. As if the monk were attempting to wring sympathy from the future. You give it. Because think about it, copying a manuscript wasn't like tapping keys on a laptop. This was ink made from soot and vinegar, on parchment that smelled vaguely of the cow it once was, written with a feather plucked from a goose that might have honked angrily about the whole arrangement. Every curve of every letter was hand-drawn. Every mistake had to be scraped off with a blade and started over. There were no shortcuts. No Control+C. And the writing style, insular script, with its looping, interlocked characters, required the sort of precision that would make a modern calligrapher weep into their mechanical pencil. No wonder the margins became a dumping ground for bodily complaints. My back aches. One scribe mutters in a psalter. I am very cold, says another, wedged between the lines of a passion narrative. And in a manuscript that's otherwise radiant with gold-leafed initials, a hidden scrawl in the bottom right corner simply says, "Too much ink, not enough light." Historians still argue whether these were mere laments, or if they serve a functional purpose, reminders for the scribe's future self or fellow monks about workspace hazards. But to you, they feel like human fingerprints, proof that behind the sanctity of the text sat someone who was just trying to get through the day. There's a bit of gallows humor to it, too. One manuscript margin reads, "Here ends the first part of the pain." You flip the page. The first line of the next section, the second part begins. "We see you, brother cynic." And then there's the classic complaint. Let me not be thrown into the scriptorium today. A solid contender for most relatable mood, 846 AD edition. Still, not all physical were ended in whining. Some scribes went the poetic route, like the monk who, clearly scribbling after sunset, added this gem beneath the psalm. "The candle is my enemy. Its smoke coils like the serpent. My eyes water. Yet the Lord's word must shine." See? A little dramatic, but points for style. Others, perhaps halfway between prayer and passive aggression, left notes like, "A copy with a heart full of grace." And also cramps, a duality most modern workers can relate to. But what's even more surprising is how these little side complaints often sit right beside passages about divine joy or eternal salvation. You'll have a beautiful line about heavenly peace, and right underneath, "I haven't eaten since Sext. My stomach sings of fish." Mood. One manuscript, likely copied over several seasons, features a kind of accidental time-lapse. Early folios show neat, crisp handwriting. But by the middle, things get sloppier. The lines start to wobble. And then, "I fear my ink has frozen," followed a few pages later by, "It melted again. God be thanked." So you get a weather report along with your Latin psalms. Sometimes, if you're lucky, these entries even include drawings. One tired monk doodled a cat stretching across the margin next to the line. "I envy his freedom." Another added a stick figure of himself lying face down on the script, tiny lines radiating from his back to indicate pain. It's an early cartoon, possibly the first documented comic strip about burnout. And let's not forget the monks with a flair for sarcasm. Like the one who copied the entire book of Ruth, then ended it with, "I have finished." And not a moment too soon, lest I go blind or mad. Relatable. But amidst the aches and I strain, there's a quiet sense of perseverance too. These weren't just kvetching monks looking to vent. These were professionals, artists of the sacred, people who believed that even their suffering was part of the devotion, because each letter, each flourish, each cramped knuckle was in service of something greater, a text preserved, a scripture honored, a generation taught to read and believe. You stretch your own arms a little now, sympathetically, as if you've inherited their muscle memory across the centuries. In a way, you have. Every typed word, every scribble in your own notebook follows their lineage. The tired hand, the dim light, the stubborn page. It's comforting, really. To know that your minor annoyances, your coffee spills, your stiff neck, your whys in this sentence cooperating, have echoes in a monastery on a cliff in 890 AD. They complained. They copied. They endured. And they added a few jokes in the margins to make it bearable. Maybe you will too. The sky over the scriptorium begins to darken again. The kind of medieval Irish gloom that turns afternoon into evening with no warning, as if God's hand passed briefly over the sun and forgot to move. You pull your cloak tighter. Not because you're cold, really. Just because it seems like the sort of thing someone would do in a place like this, reading things not meant to be read. We're almost to the end now. And that's exactly where tonight's scribes are heading to. Because while monks might have whined about their backs and doodled cats in the margins, they also knew the solemn joy, the deep relief, of finishing a manuscript, and their celebratory notes, tucked into the final pages like confetti made of ink, are some of the most delightful marginalia of all. Right there, at the bottom of a massive homily compilation, you find a note. Thanks be to God, it is finished. Classic. Simple. Final. A whisper of amen with a side of finally. And that phrase appears again and again. Across gospel books, psalters, missals, penitentials, every kind of religious manuscript you can imagine. Always in slightly different wording, always with a distinct personality. Some are pious. Let all who read this give glory to God. Some are cheeky. It is done. I can eat again. Some have strong, exasperated energy. Finished at last. This took longer than Lent. Historians still argue whether these closers were meant to mark liturgical completion, personal milestones, or just the unfiltered sigh of a man whose hand had become one with the quill. Probably all of the above. You flip to another manuscript and spot a line in Latin. It translates to, "Here ends the work of a fool and a sinner." May God forgive the mess. Tell us how you really feel, Brother Owen. But some endings are surprisingly emotional. Like the monk who, at the end of a meticulously copied psalter, wrote, "I leave this book as I leave a friend. We have walked many hours together." That one gets you. Because you realize how many hours he must have spent on it, hundreds, maybe thousands. How many days he sat hunched in his chilly cell, watching letters bloom like ivy across the page, waiting for the last amen. There's even a note from one scribe to the next, as if passing a baton. If you continue this work, friend, may your hands be steadier than mine. You imagine someone reading that centuries later, pausing, maybe even smiling, before picking up the next folio. Of course, not all closing notes are poetic. One bold scribe ended a manuscript with, "Finished by me, Domino." And if anyone adds errors to this, may his nose rot and his teeth fall like leaves in winter. A little aggressive. But hey, he put in the hours. Let him vent. In another volume, there's a different kind of closing, a list of names. Scholars believe this was a group project, a rare collaboration where several monks worked together to finish a large tome. And at the end, each one signed in a different hand. Macruadri wrote the first 20. Murchid copied the rest. Finnan added the verse. And I, Coleman, bound the book. May it last longer than we do. That's the part that gets you. Because it's true, isn't it? The monks are gone. Their cells cold, their stones worn by centuries of rain. But the book is still here. Still legible. Still talking. Still being read by you right now, under the hush of sleep. Even the jokers couldn't escape the gravity of that. In one particularly worn gospel manuscript, a tired scribe scratched this note under the final chapter. If this book survives fire, flood, and fools, it deserves a better reader than me. You feel that one. Hard. Then there's the monk who simply wrote, "I have finished. I am tired. I am blessed. No fanfare. No jokes. Just peace." And some closings feel like a letting go, the way a poet might fold up their last verse and blow it gently out to sea. Like this one. It is ended. as all things must be. You stare at that for a moment longer than you mean to. Because it's true of this story, too. Of this night. You've journeyed through centuries of silent scribes, wandered through the whimsy and the weird, chuckled at their jokes, marveled at their sorrow, and nodded in sympathy at their stiff wrists and bad lighting. And now you feel them finishing the page, wiping the last dot of ink from their pen, sitting back in their chair, exhaling. So you do the same. Stretch, breathe, listen to the hush, because you're not just reading their work. You've joined their ritual. You've kept their memory. And maybe, in the most wonderful way, you've become part of the margins too. The final page is soft and worn beneath your fingertips, though really you're only touching it in your imagination. Still, it feels real enough. The parchment, faintly yellowed, the ink slightly faded, and there, tucked into a corner near the end, is a drawing of a tiny boat bobbing on stylized waves, beside a farewell line in slanted Latin. The sea is wide, but the Lord is near. You linger on that one. It's not technically part of the manuscript's content. It's one last whisper from the monk who copied it. Not a quote, not a prayer, more like an inside joke with God. Because here's the truth, medieval Irish monks weren't just copying old words. They were ferrying meaning across centuries, rescuing culture from storm and fire and forgetfulness. And sometimes, in the corners of all that holy text, they'd slip in a little reminder that they, too, were alive. You begin to notice something. The margins don't feel like extras anymore. They feel like the soul of the manuscript. And maybe that's because they weren't edited or planned or reviewed by Superior. They were raw, in the moment. A sneaky grin from Brother Seamus, a snarky footnote from Aidan, a grumble from Coleman that makes you laugh even though it's 1,200 years old. A scholar once said that the margins of Irish manuscripts are where the monks could breathe, and you see what he meant. This cat is a better scribe than me. One writes next to a paw print smudging the ink. That's not metaphor. An actual cat walked across his page. Instead of fixing it, he leaned into the chaos. Another monk records how many hours he's worked that day, along with how many mice he's seen. Spoiler alert. One manuscript even includes a margin poem, a short, lyrical praise of ale. Seriously. Right next to a long theological argument about divine justice is a line that roughly translates to, "El, you are the light of my eyes and the peace of my heart." Historians still argue whether this was sincere devotion or sleepy sarcasm. You hope both. And then there are the real zingers. This text is dull. May the next be better. Or the one that simply says, "Lord, save me from this handwriting." You have to wonder, was he insulting the original manuscript or his own? Either way, bold move. But not all margins are funny. One monk, alone in a northern outpost, wrote the same word 3 times in a row at the edge of a psalm. Snow, 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 nothing else. You can almost feel the cabin fever. Another page contains just one sentence, seemingly unrelated to the text. "My friend has died." That's it. No flourish. No explanation. Just grief, handwritten in a space meant for nothing. A moment of mourning frozen beside scripture. You sit with that one longer than expected. It reminds you that while we often picture medieval monks as otherworldly, isolated, chanting, far removed from real life, they were actually in it. Deeply. They lost friends. They missed meals. They stubbed toes on icy floors and cursed under their breath. They tried to focus on the divine, but kept getting distracted by cats and hunger and existential dread. You relate. In fact, you're starting to feel a strange kinship with these long-gone scribes. Maybe it's the lateness of the hour. Maybe it's the ASMR hush of your own heartbeat. But it's like their voices have been traveling toward you this whole time, not from the center of the text, but from the edges, from the margins. And suddenly, it hits you. The margins were never just a place for scribbles. They were a conversation. between the scribe and himself, between monks across generations, between them and you, between all of us, really. You glance at one final note, one last act of marginal rebellion, scratched into the blank bottom of a mostly finished page. If you are reading this, I hope you are warm. You smile. And somehow, in that simple wish, you feel seen. So now the ink dries. The candle fades. The pages you've wandered through, those slow looping passages of prayer and pause, close like a door eased gently shut on well-worn hinges. You stretch again softly and imagine the quiet of that stone scriptorium, far away, far back in time. Imagine the low murmur of monks moving like shadows, the scratch of a quill, the flicker of firelight over gold-leafed words, the steady beat of silence, broken only by breath and birdsong, and maybe the occasional sneeze from too much dust. It's all far behind you now, a little fogged by distance, softened like an old story told under a warm blanket. You've made your way through the margins, those sleepy little notes full of complaints and cats and cold feet, and you've found in their quiet corners something surprisingly human. Kind of closeness, a shared fatigue, a shared wonder. And maybe, if you listen carefully, you'll still hear the last rustle of a rope, the tiniest laugh, the slow exhale of someone, somewhere, finally finishing their work. Let it comfort you. Let it ease you. You've traveled far tonight. You deserve rest. So pull the covers a little higher. Let the rhythm of breath steady your mind. Drift backward, not into history now, but into stillness. There's nothing left to copy, nothing to write. Just sleep waiting at the edge of the page. Good night.